Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Antediluvian Architects Theory. In 1918, the British anthropologist James George Fraser published Folklore in the Old Testament through Cambridge University Press, a systematic catalog of more than 200 flood narratives collected from cultures across 6 continents. Fraser was not constructing a theological argument. He was performing comparative mythology, subjecting oral traditions to the same archival discipline applied to legal texts, and what emerged from that discipline was not a single story with regional variations, but a structural pattern so consistent across disconnected cultures that variation itself became the anomaly requiring explanation. The Sumerian account of Utnapishtim predates Genesis by at least 1,500 years. The Babylonian Atrahasis tablet, the Hindu Manu narratives, the Chinese Gunyu cycle, the Aztec account of Coxcox, the Greek Deucalion myth, each describes a prior civilization of significant attainment, destroyed by water, with survivors arriving by boat, carrying knowledge, rather than simply genetic continuation. Not regional versions of a shared experience, structurally identical accounts from populations separated by oceans and 10,000 years of independent development. The geological record does not contradict this. At the close of the last ice age, beginning approximately 12,000 years before present, global sea level rose an estimated 400 feet over 10,000 years, an inundation that submerged 27 million square miles of coastal and low-lying terrain that was, by Pleistocene population models, the most densely inhabited land on Earth, not gradual enough to be imperceptible, rapid enough, in geological pulses, to have destroyed everything built within reach of the new shoreline. The archaeological record produces its own friction. At Baalbek, in modern Lebanon, the foundation platform of the Roman temple complex rests on 3 stones, the trilithon, each weighing approximately 1,000 tons, quarried, transported, and positioned with tolerances that Roman-era engineering has never been demonstrated capable of achieving. The Osirion at Abydos, Egypt, its architectural style inconsistent with the surrounding New Kingdom construction above it, its granite blocks weighing hundreds of tons, its style closer to the Old Kingdom or earlier, sits below grade as though the Nile itself silted over it across millennia. Graham Hancock's 1995 book, Fingerprints of the Gods, was dismissed on the conclusions. The evidence cited in that dismissal was rarely the structural anomalies themselves. The Great Pyramid's orientation to true north deviates by 0.05 degrees, a margin of error that surpasses the accuracy of the Paris Observatory when it was constructed in 1667. A structure built by a civilization we classify as emerging, achieving a navigational precision that post-Enlightenment Europe could not replicate, using a technology we cannot identify, leaving no prototype and no debris trail of failed experiments. That is the standard archaeological position, not a mystery, a settled question. The convergence problem has a name in the academic literature: parallelism. The mainstream resolution holds that similar environmental stressors, flooding, drought, catastrophic inundation, produce similar cognitive responses, and that the structural correspondence across flood narratives reflects shared cognitive architecture rather than a shared event. That resolution requires 200 independent cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, to independently generate not merely the concept of a flood but the same specific detail. Survivors who arrive by boat carrying knowledge, not survivors who rebuild. Survivors who teach. The knowledge transfer is the structural element that independent environmental cognition does not produce. The teaching is what 200 accounts have in common. Parallelism does not account for it. The question of what 27 million square miles of submerged continental shelf contains has not been systematically asked. The shelf is accessible. The surveys have not been funded. Number 2. The Gobekli Tepe inheritance theory. In 1994, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived at a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey called Gobekli Tepe, a name translating roughly as Potbelly Hill, to survey a site that an American archaeological team had visited in 1963 and recorded as a medieval cemetery. The 1963 team had encountered carved limestone slabs protruding from the hillside. They noted the slabs. They left. Schmidt recognized what the carved surfaces represented. Not medieval funerary markers, but Neolithic iconography. Animals rendered with a skill and a scale that had no business existing in the landscape of 10,000 BC. What excavation revealed over the following 2 decades was not consistent with any existing model of early human civilization. T-shaped limestone pillars, some reaching 18 feet in height and weighing up to 10 tons, arranged in concentric circles with complex animal reliefs. Foxes, boars, vultures, aurochs, snakes, carved into stone with a technical fluency that presupposes not an emerging artistic tradition, but a mature one. Dating placed the site at 12,000 years old, predating the invention of pottery by 1,500 years, predating writing by more than 6,000 years, predating the wheel by at least 5,000. Not early civilization. Civilization before civilization was supposed to begin. The organizational mathematics are not casual. Minimum estimates for quarrying, transporting, and erecting a single 10-ton T-pillar across terrain without wheel or draft animal require coordinated labor of at least 500 workers, ISF, workers who required feeding, housing, and direction over extended periods. The hunter-gatherer model assigned to human populations at 10,000 BC does not produce 500 organized workers. It does not produce a surplus food economy capable of sustaining a non-subsistence labor force. Schmidt's conclusion, published in the journal Antiquity in 1995, inverted the accepted sequence. First came the temple, then the city. Not a refinement of the existing model, a direct reversal of its foundational assumption. Then, around 8,000 BC, someone buried it. Approximately 300,000 cubic feet of rubble, stone debris, animal bones, compacted soil, were deliberately deposited over the site's structures in an act that required as much organized labor as the original construction. Not abandonment, not collapse. Intentional, systematic concealment, which preserved the site with extraordinary completeness precisely because whoever buried it understood that preservation would result from burial. That act implies a degree of forward projection, an understanding that this place would matter to someone who did not yet exist, that belongs to no behavioral model assigned to 8,000 BC populations. In 2013, Giulio Magli, of Milan Polytechnic, published a paper proposing that the carved reliefs at Gobekli Tepe encode astronomical alignments, CPS, specifically the rising position of Orion's belt, as it would have appeared at 10,950 BC, approximately 3,000 years before the site itself was constructed. The argument is technical and contested, but the contested element is not the astronomy. The astronomical calculation is verifiable. The contested element is what the builders of 10,000 BC were doing with astronomical knowledge that referenced a period 3,000 years before them, knowledge they could only possess if someone had passed it. Forward. Inherited information requires a source. A source requires a civilization capable of generating astronomical records across generations. A civilization of that kind, at that date, is not in the archaeological record. The academic framework places Gobekli Tepe in the category of precocious anomaly, MCA, a site that challenges the accepted timeline without overturning it, because no corresponding tradition of equivalent complexity emerged from the same population. That framing explains the site's existence without engaging the burial. A civilization that deliberately conceals its most significant structure beneath 300,000 cubic feet of fill is not walking away from it. It is putting it somewhere specific, for a reason that extends beyond the civilization doing the burying. Preservation is a future tense act. It requires a recipient the preservers did not expect to meet. Approximately 95% of Gobekli Tepe remains unexcavated. Whatever was buried there is still in the ground. Number 3. The Younger Dryas Impact Civilization. In 2007, Richard Firestone of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. A paper co-authored by a team of 26 researchers drawn from space, 16 institutions across North America and Europe. The team had assembled to investigate a specific problem: the simultaneous extinction of 35 species of North American megafauna at approximately 12,900 years before present. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, the American horse, the short-faced bear. A disappearance so abrupt and so comprehensive that existing models of gradual climate change and human overhunting had failed, across decades of inquiry, to produce a satisfactory mechanism. What the Firestone team found in the geological layer corresponding to 12,900 BP was not what extinction models predicted. The younger Dryas boundary layer, a thin geological stratum deposited at precisely 12,900 years before present and identifiable at sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, contains a suite of materials that do not occur together in natural terrestrial geology: nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, iridium, and elevated platinum concentrations. Nanodiamonds, hexagonal crystalline carbon structures measuring billionths of a meter, form only under conditions of extreme pressure and heat that do not occur in terrestrial geological processes. Their presence, at the same stratigraphic layer, at more than 50 sites across 3 continents, is consistent with a single causal event. That event is a cosmic impact. The Carolina Bays complicate the picture further. Approximately 500,000 shallow, elliptical depressions distributed across the southeastern United States, from New Jersey to Georgia, all oriented along a consistent northwest to southeast axis. Not random, not geological. The orientations are consistent with a low-angle impact debris field radiating from a point to the northwest, precisely the geometry a fragmented comet or bolide would produce at the proposed impact trajectory. No satisfactory alternative origin for 500,000 aligned elliptical depressions has been produced. The Clovis culture disappears at exactly 12,900 BP. The most technologically advanced pre-Columbian North American civilization, identified by its distinctive fluted stone projectile points found at sites from Montana to Mexico, vanishes from the archaeological starting the snow, record at the same stratigraphic horizon as the YDB. Layer. Not gradual decline. Absence. Genetic studies of indigenous American populations identify a population bottleneck in maternal lineages dating to approximately the same period. A reduction so severe that contemporary demographic models require a catastrophic event to account for it. The proposed mechanism is not a single crater-forming impact, but an airburst or fragmented comet detonation, similar in type to the 1908 Tunguska event over Siberia, which leveled 830 square miles of forest without producing a crater, but orders of magnitude larger in energy release. A fragmented comet does not leave a single impact scar. It leaves a distributed signature across a geological layer, exactly what the YDB evidence presents. As of 2024, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has been confirmed by independent research teams and contested by others. It has not been refuted. The contested versus refuted distinction is the one the mainstream narrative consistently collapses, treating the absence of consensus as the presence of disproof, which is not what the evidence record supports. The question the hypothesis raises is not what caused the Younger Dryas boundary event. The question is what it destroyed. Number 4. The Vitrified Fortress Theory. In 1777, the geologist John Williams presented Observations on the Vitrified Forts of Scotland to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, the first systematic attempt to explain a phenomenon noted in the Scottish Highlands. For generations, stone walls, in various states of partial or complete fusion, their constituent granite and quartzite reduced to a glassy, slag-like aggregate across surfaces and sections that no subsequent fire event could account for. Williams proposed that the vitrification was intentional, a construction technique employed by the original builders to harden and bind the stone. Every structural engineer who has examined the sites in the 2.5 centuries since has reached the opposite conclusion. Vitrification weakens the stone. The walls are harder to explain after that proposal, not easier. The geographic distribution eliminates local anomaly. More than 60 confirmed vitrified forts exist in Scotland alone, with additional sites documented in France, most notably the Camp de Perron in Brittany, as well as Germany, Sweden, and Bohemia. A continental pattern across northwestern Europe, concentrated but not isolated, spanning a geographic range that implies either a shared technical tradition or a shared external cause. Neither has been operationalized. The continental distribution was established by systematic survey. It has not been seriously challenged. The thermodynamic problem is precise and unambiguous. Vitrifying granite requires sustained temperatures between 1,470 and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained across hundreds of square feet of stone surface simultaneously. Wood fires built against stone walls, the most frequently proposed mechanism, do not achieve this. Not in theory, and not in practice. In the 1990s, John Barber of Historic Scotland conducted controlled burn experiments at multiple sites, constructing large timber fires against stone wall sections under conditions designed to maximize heat transfer. The results produced localized surface scorch and isolated patches of partial melting at individual contact points, not fusion. Not the uniform conversion of wall sections to glassy aggregate found at the actual sites. At Tap O'Noth in Aberdeenshire, one of the most extensively vitrified hill forts in Scotland, its summit wall running approximately 490 feet in length, the vitrification is consistent across entire sections of wall, not concentrated at isolated points of highest heat exposure. Irregular fire spread produces irregular vitrification. The pattern at Tap O'Noth is not irregular. That discrepancy between what uncontrolled burning produces and what is found at the sites is not a minor technical detail. It is the entire problem. The dating places most vitrified forts in the Iron Age, between 800 BC and 400 AD. The Iron Age toolkit, iron smelting, controlled forge temperatures, military engineering with incendiary applications, does not include a heat source capable of sustaining 1,470 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit across the exterior surface of a stone fortification wall. Not at scale, not with consistency, and not in a pattern suggesting application from outside the wall face rather than within. The vitrification at several sites is concentrated on the exterior wall surface, the face exposed to an approaching force, rather than distributed uniformly through the wall's depth, as internal burning would produce. Not a siege technique known to the Iron Age, not an accidental consequence of incendiary attack, not explained by the toolkit assigned to the period. The thermodynamic gap does not narrow with additional study. The weapon hypothesis is the only one remaining. Number 5. The Oronteus Finaeus cartography hypothesis. In 1966, Charles Hapgood, a professor of the history of science at Keene State College in New Hampshire, published Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings through Chilton Books, a methodical examination of a set of medieval and Renaissance-era maps depicting coastlines and geographic features their supposed creators had no knowper, documented means of knowing. Before publication, Hapgood submitted his core findings to the cartographic section of the United States Air Force for independent technical assessment. The submission was not a promotional gesture. Hapgood had been working from a position of institutional credibility for more than a decade. In January 1955, Albert Einstein had written to him directly, having reviewed an earlier manuscript on the subject. Einstein's letter, dated January 6, 1955, states in part, "I find your hypothesis extremely fascinating and original." The central exhibit is the Oronteus Finaeus world map of 1531, a Renaissance cartographic production that depicts, with unmistakable geographic intention, a large southern continent. Not a decorative convention. Not a hypothetical Terra Australis placeholder inserted to balance the known northern landmasses. A continent with a defined coastline, river systems feeding interior drainage basins, and mountain ranges shown in profile. The continent depicted on the Finaeus map predates the official European discovery of Antarctica in 1820 by 289 years. The discovery of Antarctica did not resolve the problem. It deepened it. The accuracy of the Finaeus depiction is specific enough to be measurable. The map correctly positions the Ross Sea. It depicts the Antarctic Peninsula with reduced ice coverage consistent with a partially ice-free state. Interior geographic features shown on the map, drainage patterns, elevated terrain, correspond to subglacial topography not confirmed by modern survey until the International Geophysical Year seismic echo sounding campaigns of 1958, 427 years after the Finaeus map was drawn. The Piri Reis map, produced in 1513 by the Turkish admiral of the same name and now held in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, also shows Antarctic coastline in recognizable detail. Reis's own notations state the map was compiled from older source documents, some of which, by his account, dated to the 4th century BC. The U.S. Air Force assessment arrived in 1960. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, writing on behalf of the Strategic Air Command's cartographic unit, confirmed in a letter to Hapgood that the southern continent, shown on the Finaeus map, matched the subglacial topography of Antarctica as determined by modern seismic survey. topography buried beneath ice for millennia, and entirely unknown to 16th century European cartographers by any documented means. The confirmation was specific, technical, and official. It was not retracted. The source map problem is arithmetically direct. The Finaeus map accurately depicts Antarctic coastline. Antarctica's coastline was last navigable, partially free of its current ice sheet, approximately 6,000 years ago, at the terminal phase of the last glacial maximum. Someone surveyed that coastline when it was accessible. Someone produced source documents of sufficient accuracy that a 16th century mapmaker working from them could render recognizable geography 427 years before independent scientific confirmation. That surveying civilization is not in the archaeological record. The academic response to Hapgood's cartographic evidence has not been refutation, it has been silence, not a published counter-analysis demonstrating errors in the Air Force comparison, not a competing explanation for how a 16th century mapmaker rendered subglacial Antarctic topography that was not independently confirmed until 427 years later. The cartographic accuracy is not disputed in the literature because no one in the literature has engaged it at the level of the original claim. The gap between what the evidence shows and what the academic record acknowledges has not been addressed. Charles Hapgood died in 1982. The source documents for the Finaeus map have never been located. The map was confirmed. The surveying civilization was not. Number 6. The Mohenjo-Daro thermal event theory. In 1979, David Davenport and Ettore Vincenti published 2000 Assia, Distruzione Atomica, a materials analysis of the destruction layer at Mohenjo-Daro, issued through Edizioni Futuro in Rome. Davenport had spent 12 years on site at the Indus Valley excavations before writing a word. Vincenti brought thermodynamic methodology. The publication was not a popular account. It was a technical examination of physical residue from the destruction zone of a planned urban center occupied from roughly 2500 BC and abandoned by the conventional archaeological account following an Aryan invasion from the northwest. The physical evidence documented at that destruction zone did not match an invasion. It did not match any dispersed combustion event. It matched something for which the invasion hypothesis provided no mechanism. The material designated black stones, found clustered at a defined zone within the excavation site, was analyzed as fused clay and crystalline material subjected to temperatures Davenport and Vincenti estimated at 1,400 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit and then rapidly cooled. This is not fire damage. Fire damage to mud brick and clay structures produces cracking, spalling, and differential blackening consistent with uneven combustion at variable temperatures. What Davenport documented was uniform fusion across the surface profile, the thermal fingerprint of vitrification, the same signature recorded at the Scottish Iron Age hill forts examined earlier in this video, requiring sustained heat of extraordinary uniformity applied from a direction inconsistent with fire spreading at grade level across an open site, not scattered ignition points. A single, located source. In 1927, British archaeologist Ernest Mackay excavated 44 human skeletons from the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, not from shelters, not from fortified positions, not from the spatial configurations consistent with a massacre, bodies clustered near doorways, at corridor ends, in the tactical groupings that armed assault produces in the archaeological record. Mackay found individuals lying in open streets in postures of sudden arrest, mid-stride, reclining, and in at least one documented instance, in contact with an adjacent figure consistent with two people who fell simultaneously. Weapon trauma consistent with combat was not recorded for the majority of remains. The standard interpretation requires a mechanism of death the skeletal record does not supply. Radioactivity claims were subsequently attached to the Mohenjo-Daro site by multiple researchers who reported elevated radiation readings within the destruction layer. The Archaeological Survey of India contested these reports on methodological grounds, citing inadequate instrumentation and non-standardized sampling procedure. No peer-reviewed resolution has been published as of 2024. The claim is neither confirmed nor refuted, not disproved, but suspended in the specific epistemic condition the mainstream record consistently presents as equivalent to disproof. What the physical record shows, independent of the radioactivity dispute, is an epicenter pattern. Thermal damage within the destruction zone radiates outward from a defined central point, decreasing in intensity in proportion to distance from that center. That distribution is consistent with a directed or explosive heat source. That distribution is inconsistent with fire propagating outward from multiple ignition points across an inhabited urban area. Fires spread from where they start. They do not converge. The Mahabharata, the ancient Sanskrit epic whose composition scholars date between roughly 400 BC and 400 AD, encoding oral traditions understood to be considerably older, describes weapons called brahmastras, capable of producing heat sufficient to ignite the atmosphere, light intense enough to blind soldiers at distance, and a destruction radius sufficient to erase entire cities. Modern readers have compared this language to the phenomenology of nuclear detonation. The comparison is a data point. It has not been placed inside the existing physical record and examined by the bodies responsible for that record. UNESCO's formal heritage documentation for Mohenjo-Daro carries this designation. Cause of abandonment, unknown. Not a declaration of mystery. An admission that the standard explanation does not account for the physical evidence as recovered, and that no replacement mechanism has been formally proposed or accepted by the governing body responsible for the site's preservation. The gap between what the physical record shows and what the official record says has not narrowed in 47 years. Number 7. The genetic bottleneck intervention hypothesis. In 1998, paleoanthropologist Stanley Ambrose of the University of Illinois published a paper in the Journal of Human Evolution cross-referencing the geological record of the Toba supervolcano eruption, 1905, which occurred approximately 73,000 years before present. With the anomalously compressed genetic diversity of modern human populations, Ambrose was not constructing a theory of intervention or directed survival. He was attempting to reconcile two independently measured data sets, the catastrophic scale of the Toba event and the peculiar poverty of human genetic variation. What the population floor implied, when the two records were aligned, was something the standard survival model could not comfortably absorb. The bottleneck is not in dispute. It is a structural consequence of population genetics. Reduce a breeding population to its minimum, and the variation that took millennia to accumulate compresses in a single catastrophic interval. Mitochondrial DNA lineage analysis across global populations produces one conclusion consistently. All 8 billion living human beings descend from a breeding population estimated at between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Every genetic lineage on every continent traces to the same compressed ancestral pool. The Toba eruption expelled an estimated 670 cubic miles of material from the Sumatra caldera, approximately 10,000 times the 1980 Mount Street. Helen's output, and produced a volcanic winter documented in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, estimated to have reduced global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit for a decade. The timing of the genetic bottleneck and the Toba eruption correlates within the resolution of available dating methods. Ambrose's hypothesis provides a mechanism. It does not provide a survival explanation. Anatomically, modern humans survived the Toba winter. Neanderthals survived it. Denisovans, SNC, the separate archaic human population identified from a 2010 DNA analysis of a finger bone recovered from Denisova Cave in Siberia, survived it. 3 distinct species of the genus Homo, each dependent on ambient plant and animal resources, each lacking documented agricultural infrastructure, each facing a decade of global winter at the end of the Pleistocene. The standard model explains that they survived. It does not explain the conditions in which survival was possible. Immediately following the Toba bottleneck, the genetic and archaeological record documents what researchers designate the behavioral leap, the geologically abrupt appearance of ochre-based symbolic art, composite tool manufacture requiring multi-step planning and long-distance material sourcing, and structural evidence of complex language. Not a gradual evolutionary development, a discontinuity, a capacity appearing in the record, without a documented developmental precursor in the preceding strata. Hawkes and colleagues, writing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2007, documented an acceleration in the rate of adaptive human evolution in the period following, not preceding, the survival event. The adaptation accelerated after the crisis. That is not a prediction the standard model generates. Modern human DNA contains genetic contributions from at least 3 archaic populations, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and a third source that has not been identified. The third contributor's skeletal record has not been located. its genetic contribution to modern populations has been measured. Denisovan admixture, distributed unevenly across human lineages but present in multiple populations, is concentrated in immune function enhancement and high-altitude oxygen processing adaptation. Those are survivability advantages specifically suited to a decade-long volcanic winter. You carry this genetic signature. Whatever your ancestry, whatever continent your family has occupied, your genome descends from the same few thousand people who survived conditions the models describe as inconsistent with unassisted hunter-gatherer survival at the population floor the genetics requires. The standard model explains that the floor was reached and subsequently recovered. It does not explain what held the floor in place long enough for recovery to occur. Number 8. The Antarctic Atlantis Hypothesis. Operation High Jump, formally designated United States Navy Task Force 68, departed Norfolk, Virginia in August 1946 and arrived at the Antarctic continent in December of that year. Its commander was Admiral Richard Byrd, the most experienced polar explorer in American history, holder of the Medal of Honor, veteran of 5 Antarctic expeditions before this one. The stated objective was scientific survey and polar operations training. The force Byrd commanded to execute that objective comprised 4,700 men, 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, a submarine, and a destroyer squadron, and 33 aircraft. The operation was planned for 6 to 8 months. It withdrew from Antarctica after approximately 8 weeks. No official explanation for the early termination was entered into the public record. Lake Vostok lies beneath the center of East Antarctica under approximately 2.5 miles of ice, a freshwater body roughly the size of Lake Ontario, sealed from the surface environment for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. It was confirmed as a distinct subglacial lake by Kapitsa and colleagues in a 1996 paper in Nature based on seismic and airborne radar data. Water samples recovered by Russian and drilling teams between 1998 and 2012 returned living microbial organisms adapted to conditions of total darkness, extreme pressure, and complete chemical isolation from the surface biosphere. Lake Vostok is not a geological curiosity. It is a sealed biological environment that has been evolving in isolation for longer than modern humans have existed as a species. What a 15 million year isolated ecosystem might preserve is a question the research program has not yet been funded to fully ask. In 2016, researchers using satellite gravity data published findings in scientific reports documenting a 250-mile wide elevated region beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, a subsurface mass anomaly. The authors described as potentially consistent with a remnant, large-scale geological formation, or a significant impact structure. The debate over its origin continues. The mass anomaly is measured data. Plato, in the Timaeus, written approximately 360 BC, described a continent situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, larger than Libya and Asia combined as then mapped, destroyed in a single catastrophe, and submerged. Geographer Rand Flemath, in When the Sky Fell, 1995, co-authored with Colin Wilson, constructed a geographic argument that Plato's description, y, directional relationship to the known Mediterranean world, relative scale, oceanic context, and the reported submersion, corresponds structurally to the pre-glacial Antarctic continent, as it would have appeared before the current ice advance enclosed its coastline. Not a precise fit, a structural correspondence for which no alternative source has been proposed and no formal refutation published. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in Washington in 1959 by 12 nations including both the United States and the Soviet Union, represents the only bilateral Cold War instrument of genuine operational cooperation in the era's diplomatic record. Every other arena of U.S.-Soviet engagement during that period was structured as adversarial, by design and by doctrine. The treaty prohibits military activity and nuclear testing, guarantees scientific access, and in Article 7 mandates advance notification for all inspection activities on the continent. Inspection regimes in international law are not designed for territories presumed empty. They are designed for territories where parties are assumed to be concealing something worth inspecting for. The architecture of Article 7 assumes there is something present. Admiral Byrd is reported to have described Antarctica, in a 1954 interview with the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, as an enchanted continent in the sky, land of everlasting mystery, and to have characterized its strategic importance in terms markedly disproportionate to its documented scientific value at the time. The interview's authenticity has been disputed. The 8-week early termination of Operation High Jump is documented in the Naval Historical Record and has not been disputed. Article 7 of the Antarctic Treaty does not name what it was written to find. Number 9. The Mud Flood Reset Theory. Beginning around 2017, amateur researchers, CWT, not archaeologists, not historians, not credentialed members of any academic institution, began conducting systematic photographic surveys of 19th century architecture across cities in Europe, Russia, and the United States. They were people with cameras and internet connections. What they found was not concealed in restricted archives or classified collections. It was in the exterior masonry of buildings that millions of people pass through every year without stopping to look at the ground floors. The anomaly they documented is architectural and specific. In St. Petersburg, Vienna, Chicago, Istanbul, and a significant number of additional cities, 19th century buildings. Structures with documented construction dates between approximately 1800 and 1880. Present ground floor windows, beginning at or below current street. Grade, with staircases descending to what structural analysis and period documentation identify as primary entrances. These are not basement apertures. They are full-height windows in full-height rooms with main door proportions at the bottom of the descent. The buildings were constructed from the ground up, as all buildings are. The ground they were built from is now several feet below the current street surface. The conventional explanation is gradual soil accumulation and deliberate street elevation. Standard urban infrastructure practice. Well documented in specific cities over specific timelines. Chicago raised its street grade in the 1850s and 1860s for drainage infrastructure, a program that is dated, documented, and confined to a defined geographic and administrative context. That explanation accounts for deliberate, locally administered interventions. It does not account for an identical distributional pattern appearing across St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Istanbul. Cities separated by thousands of miles, administered under 3 distinct empires, with no documented shared infrastructure program and no governing authority with the geographic reach to coordinate simultaneous street-level alteration across continental Europe and the Ottoman state. Between 1853 and 1929, the orphan train movement transported an estimated 250,000 children, classified in official records as orphans or abandoned minors, from Eastern American cities to rural placements across the continent. It was the largest organized child placement program in the recorded history of the United States. The source population for those 250,000 children, 60 where they came from, who their undocumented parents were, how a city system generating orphans at that volume reconciles with population records that do not show corresponding adult attrition across 8 decades, has not been fully accounted for in the demographic record. Maps produced by leading European cartographers of early modernity consistently document a geographic and political entity designated Tartaria, or Tartary, occupying substantial portions of Central and Northern European Asia. The 1570 Ortelius, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, and the 1595 Mercator Atlas both carry the designation. Amateur researchers have argued that this reflects not a geographic label, but a functioning political civilization subsequently erased from the historical record following a catastrophic disruption sometime in the 18th or early 19th century. The maps are primary sources. The political interpretation is contested. The designation's consistency across independent cartographic traditions is not. United States Census records from 1800 to 1850 show population distribution patterns that standard demographic modeling, migration curves, frontier settlement rates, birth and mortality projections does not fully reconcile in certain regions. The standard attribution is incomplete record keeping under frontier conditions. Incomplete records produce gaps. They do not produce systematic distributional anomalies. The anomaly and the absence are not the same data type. The Chicago explanation is an explanation for Chicago. The documented street elevation of the 1850s and 1860s was a bounded administrative project with dated engineering records, a named contractor, and a defined geographic scope. It closes the question for Chicago. It closes the question for no other city on the list. The architectural distribution across St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Istanbul was not produced by a shared infrastructure program because no shared infrastructure program existed. 3 separate empires administered those cities under 3 separate legal and engineering traditions with no documented coordination. The anomaly is continental. The explanation is local. Those are not the same scale. What separates the mudflood theory from standard fringe framing is the character of its primary evidence. The theory's specific proposition that the world currently inhabited is not the first version of this project, that at some point between 1750 and 1850 a prior civilization was reset and a replacement population was seated in structures it did not build, rests not on a hidden document or suppressed testimony, but on the ground floors of buildings that anyone can visit. The windows are still below grade. The staircases still descend. The evidence has not moved. Number 10. The Cyclic Cataclysm Extinction Hypothesis. In 1969, Giorgio de Santillana, professor of history of science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Ertha von Dechend, physicist at J.W. Goethe University in Frankfurt, published Hamlet's Mill, an essay investigating the origins of human knowledge and its transmission through myth through Gambit Incorporated of Boston. The book runs 505 pages. De Santillana was not pursuing a unified theory of mythology. He was tracing the origins of scientific thought through the oldest recoverable human records, attempting to locate the moment when human beings first began observing the sky with the disciplined regularity required to construct a systematic model of it. What he found was not a historical moment. It was a number, embedded in the mythology of 5 continents, encoded in astronomical ratios too precise to have arrived independently. The number is 25,920. It is the period, measured in years, required for Earth's rotational axis to complete one full precession cycle. The slow wobble that traces the celestial pole through all 12 constellations of the zodiac and returns to its point of origin. Ancient cultures designated it the Great Year and divided it into 12 ages of 2,160 years each. To measure 25,920, a civilization must already be watching the sky when the measurement begins. No single human lifetime observes the motion. No single generation records it. Measuring the full cycle requires continuous, inherited, disciplined observation across a span longer than recorded history. De Santillana and von Dechend found 25,920, and its primary factors, 72, 360, 2,160, encoded across sources with no documented contact. The dimensional and proportional relationships of the Great Pyramid of Giza encode precession cycle ratios within their geometry. The Hindu Yuga system divides cosmological time into units that are direct multiples of 25,920. The Babylonian king lists record pre-flood reign lengths that resolve to precession factors when their base 60 arithmetic is converted. The 432,000 warriors described in Norse mythology as filling the halls of Valhalla yield, divided against the precession base, the same ratio used in Babylonian astronomical calculation. The Mayan long count calendar, developed in Mesoamerica with no documented contact with any of these traditions, encodes the identical 25,920-year cycle. Not coincidence. A number too precise to arrive independently in 5 separate astronomical traditions without a common transmission source. Every tradition that encodes the precession cycle also describes the transition between ages as catastrophe, not allegory, structural description of flood, fire, celestial displacement, and the fall of a civilization that preceded the one encoding the account. The catastrophe is not a moral judgment in most of these traditions. It is a mechanical consequence. The sky completes its cycle. Something follows. The survivor-teacher archetype appears in every tradition that carries this pattern. Utnapishtim in Sumerian mythology, Manu in the Hindu tradition, Noah in the biblical text, Deucalion in Greek mythology, ESA. In each case, a small group survives by specific means and does not merely rebuild. They teach. They transmit what the civilization before them knew, in the only medium that survives catastrophe without physical infrastructure, story. The number travels inside the story. The number is the point. The logical chain requires only the evidence already presented. If these cultures preserved the 25,920-year cycle in their mythologies, they understood precession. If they understood precession, They had been observing the sky continuously long enough to measure a 26,000-year cycle, which means they were observing before the last catastrophe they describe. If they were observing before the last catastrophe and survived it, they encoded the warning in the most durable format available to them. If that warning appears in mythologies on every inhabited continent, the encoding was intentional. If the encoding was intentional, if someone preserved, across catastrophe, the precise number that measures the interval between catastrophes, then someone was here before us, and they knew this would happen again. You are reading a warning that was written before the last time this happened. The question is not whether there was a civilization before ours. The question is whether we are the civilization they were warning. 10 anomalies in this video: the submerged coastlines, the buried temples, the vitrified stone, the maps that should not exist, the genetic floor that survival alone cannot explain, the thermal destruction, the sealed continent, the architectural reset, and a number encoded in the mythology of every culture that survived the last age, do not point in different directions. They point at the same interval, the same 12,000-year boundary, the same transition between what was and what replaced it. Subscribe. The evidence continues in the next video. Like it if the chain held. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Someone on the other side of this planet read the same warning tonight.